So we're all going to have some Duane stories, and I hope we can share those. So I'll introduce our two panelists. I'll tell some Duane stories, and then we'll move a microphone around, and folks can share whatever they want. And then we'll go back to the great gift from Al Harper on those little sandwiches, the beer, the wine, so forth. So just Duane is someone that I was in touch with for years as a Western historian. He was always encouraging, always had a smile and a handshake, and was an expert mining historian. I mean, he left a scholarly legacy that I don't think will be equaled in the state of Colorado for mining, but his research went beyond that. And he wrote about Colorado politicians, he wrote about mining, he helped create the Western History Association, which is alive and well all these years later. And he was a lot of fun as a colleague. I'll tell some stories about him, but one story, when I began as director of the Center of Southwest Studies, he had been the director, and he had all these connections, and said that he had found this fabulous group of photographs from Montrose, and that we needed to purchase them. And I needed to come up with $7,000 overnight to do that. And so we did, and went and retrieved them from Montrose, and it was one of the real pioneer photographers from the Western Slopes. So it was a great catch. But it had another catch to it, in that most of these were glass plates, and most of these, there were other film that were nitrate based, and that's highly flammable. And once we figured that out, the Durango fire chief said, you can't even have that film on campus. So we had to take it out to the old fort and then slowly bring it back and duplicate them, and it's pretty interesting. But those glass plates were solid, not the nitrate film, and they're here, and really interesting images. So it'll be a great night to talk about Duane, think about Duane and his eagerness with students. My goodness, he had a legacy of history students and general education students. One of his most famous classes was the history of baseball, and I don't think any athlete ever flunked that class. So we're going to start off with Sherry Rochford Figs. Sherry and I go back 25 years also. Sherry knew Duane as a campus colleague, and Duane was a real enthusiast at FLC sporting events. Sherry was director of admissions at Fort Lewis, oversaw the Alumni Association, went through all sorts of different career moves here and there on campus, and then was finally executive director of the Fort Lewis College Foundation. And so Sherry will speak here in just a second. And then our other panelist is Dr. John Kessel, former National Park Service historian, founding editor of the Journals of Don Diego de Vargas, 1691 to 1704, at the University of New Mexico. Knew Duane for over half a century. Wow, that is excellent. And Dr. Kessel was an expert on the Spanish Southwest and a former Duane Smith lecturer. So one of the reasons we're here tonight is to raise a little money for the Duane Smith lecture series. So in the history department, we have a lecture for Reese Kelly, which brings in sort of international historians and European historians. We have a public history lecture, so Reese Kelly's in the spring, we've got a public history lecture in the fall, and then the history department teams with the Center of Southwest Studies for a Duane Smith lecturer, and we were chugging along, and then came COVID, and so the train kind of went off track, but Corey's very interested in starting that up again, as we are in history. So Dr. Kessel was one of those Duane Smith lecturers, taught on campus for a couple of semesters. Yeah. And his books include Kiva, Cross, and Crown, Spain in the Southwest, Pueblos, Spaniards, and the Kingdom of New Mexico. He's also an expert on Miera y Pacheco with his book Whither the Waters, and Pacheco was the first map maker for the Southwest. And we have copies of that map. Dr. Kessel's still looking for some originals that have disappeared somewhere in England. But it's really great to have him. He's retired to our county, La Plata County, lives between Durango and Bayfield. So we'll start with Sherry, then we'll have Dr. Kessel, and then I'll talk a little more about Duane and read some of the obituary comments. One of the great things about the Durango Herald, and there are many great things, is that you can add to stories and continue to make comments. And so when Dr. Smith's obituary ran, people continued to write in. And a lot of them are FLC students, so I want to read what they had to say. But please join me in welcoming Sherry Figgs. Right?
It's good to see a lot of familiar faces, and I'm really honored to be here. Today, my day got kind of chopped up. One of my friends lost her husband, and so I grew up in Durango, so we were friends since high school. So we gathered over at her house, and her two sisters were there. Well, they found out I was coming up here today, and her sister said, Duane was the most influential person in my life. I became a history teacher because of Duane Smith. And we just started telling all these Duane Smith stories, and I think my friend felt a lot better too about this. But thank you, Andy, for asking me to be here. And I first met Duane Smith when I was a 7th grade student at Miller Junior High here in Durango. I'm not going to tell you the exact date, but it was in the 60s. And my science teacher was a woman named Grace Erickson, who was a really outstanding science teacher. But she finally said, I think I've given you all the information that you need. You need to go up and see Dr. Delaney at the Center of Southwest Studies. So she gave me his number. I called him. We lived on Florida Road at the time, so I could just hike up Calico Hill, or now Chapman Hill. And I had an appointment with Dr. Delaney. Well, who would be there but Duane? So we became fast friends since that time, and it was quite wonderful. And fast forward several years, I became a student at Fort Lewis College. I didn't want to come to Fort Lewis. I started out at UNC in Greeley, but my father passed away. My mother said, sorry, you got to come home. And so I thought, well, I'll make the best of it at Fort Lewis and maybe get back. But I ended up staying here, and one of my majors was history. And of course, I had Duane and several other excellent professors. But what I always loved about Duane, I just loved his classes, and I tried to be the best student. And when I'd see him walking across the campus, he'd go, hello, favorite student. And I would say, oh, I bet he really liked my paper that I did. And well, one day I'm walking across campus, and I hear, hello, favorite student. But it wasn't meant for me. And then it created quite a scandal on campus because we realized Duane had a lot of favorite students. And but he was demanding and challenging, and so we forgave him. He was a prolific writer, and the one thing that I loved about him is, even though I think he wrote probably 50 books, he always gave credit to Gay, his wife. And she was a wonderful editor. And he always would say, I wouldn't be able to do this if Gay was not the wonderful editor. So he was always willing to give her a lot of credit. And he said to me, the best day of my life was when she agreed to marry me. The next best day of my life is when we had Laura Lee. So He was just a wonderful family man and dedicated to the college and his students. I think I bought almost every book that he has written, and for my stepdad, because he loved his books, and Duane would autograph every single one of them. And when my father died, I inherited all those books with the wonderful handwritten comments that he wrote about. And Duane was so loving of Fort Lewis College. He would do anything to help us. And when I first started my career, I was in the admission office. And we had to do a lot of Saturday visits because we were so far away from the Front Range where a lot of our students came from. Duane would, even at last minute notice, if I needed somebody to come up and talk to a student and the parents, he would do it. And he really did kind of help us build our enrollment. And we came up with this plan. At one time, Fort Lewis was part of the Colorado State University system. And we decided that we were going to call Phil Austin, who was the chancellor there, and see if we could get a bus from CSU and bring counselors down here. Because if you remember when the old saying, as Duane goes out of the way and glad of it, you know. So we called Phil Austin and told him what we were trying to do. And Dr. Austin said, well, you have that wonderful history professor, Duane Smith. I have an idea how you can get more counselors down there. And I said, okay, I'm game. He says, we will give, if Duane will come up with a comprehensive syllabus, and if he'll come up with you and ride the bus down, and we'll take the students then to the counselors to Mesa Verde and do some things, and then he can create some other work. They can get their college credit through our continuing ed, but they can get it at the advanced level of a master's degree, because at the time Fort Lewis didn't have a master's degree. Well, that's what we did. Duane rode up with me. We got on the bus. We had about 30 counselors. They hung on every word. It was one of the most remarkable trips that I've ever been part of. And I still keep in touch with a lot of those counselors. Most have retired, but they always would ask about how Duane's doing. So he was really instrumental in a lot of our recruitment. Duane and I were both members of the All Sports Hall of Fame. And it's a hard thing to pick people to be part of that. And I just need to grab a drink of water. And he was really hard on students. And he kept every single grade book all the way through until he retired. And when we would have these meetings to select people to be in the All Sports Hall of Fame, boy, if you were not a good student, you didn't make it with him, because he said, no, I have my grade book here, that guy, he didn't show up, and no, he might have been the best athlete in the world, but he's not getting in. And he didn't, they didn't get in. And but you know, Duane had a dark side. Maybe you guys didn't know that, but we would go to a lot of the athletic events, and I would often sit with he and Gay, and there was a coach that he just did not like, Dick Dragmeister, and Dick is no longer with us, but he was a coach over in Silver City, New Mexico, at Western New Mexico University, and then later at Adams State. And we had a vice president for student affairs, Ed Frymuth. I don't know if any of you remember Ed. And he and Duane were really good friends. Well, when Dick would come to town to play basketball, Duane and Ed would camp out right behind their team, and he would harass that Dick Dragmeister. And I would say, Duane, this is a side of you I've never seen. I said, you really kind of have a dark side. And I said, but I guess, I won't tell anybody, but everybody saw it that was going to the games. And so you heard it here. He was not perfect. He was close. Well, Duane and my dad were both in Sunshine Gardens together. So I got to see a lot of him after he was in Sunshine Gardens. And Bob Hoffman, who was being inducted into the All Sports Hall of Fame, said, Sherry, you've got to get Duane up to that event. And I said, well, let me see if Laura Lee can bring him. And so I called Laura, and they had some out-of-town event. So I said, well, if it's okay with you, Laura, I'll bring him. My husband and I will pick him up. And so we did. We went to Sunshine Gardens and got him. And we're coming up to the campus, and he kept asking, why are we going? What are we doing? And then he says, I'm having some memory issues. And I said, yeah, I know that. And he goes, but I want to tell you, if you want to know what happened in 1888, I'm still your guy. Well, that night, I got him up there, and we sat him at Bob Hoffman's table and got him food. And I had a couple of alums. I said, you need to help make sure if he needs to get to the restroom. And they took care of it. Well, every speaker that was inducted that night paid tribute to him. And he just sat there, just glowing. He was just so happy, and everybody was talking to him. My worry was the program, as you know, a lot of you have been at those programs. They go on and on and on. And I kept looking at my watch, and I know what time I had to get my dad back to Sunshine Gardens, and I had to take Duane back to, and it was like 11:30. And but we're driving back home, and I said, Duane, we're probably going to get you in trouble because all the doors are going to be locked and everything. He goes, yeah, but it's worth it. It was the most wonderful night, wasn't it? And I said, it sure was. And he just so enjoyed being part of that. Later, I went in kind of into the fundraising part of it, and we had an event at Fort Lewis, and Dean, you remember this, TLC for FLC, and we would have auctions down at Toatin Gallery, and Duane would, always donate things, but we every year would auction off a trip to Chaco Canyon, and that was a really high dollar item. And Jim Judge, the late Jim Judge, who did a lot of his early research at Chaco Canyon and who was a professor of anthropology here, he would usually do, and we would take a little travel van and go down. And one time he got sick. Jim got sick, and it was at the last minute. So I told my colleague, Deborah Yerota, I said, well, I'm going to call Duane. Maybe he'll do it. Maybe he'll fill in. Because people paid a lot of money for these trips. And Duane was really wary, but I said, well, Duane, Deborah Yerota has made homemade cinnamon rolls. And then when I told him what the lunch menu was, he finally relented. And he was a hit. And so we decided we would auction off 2 trips. We'd let Jim Judge keep doing one, and then Duane could do another one. And then only thing we had to do is promise cinnamon rolls and good food. And Duane came through. And we actually raised some great funds for the Center of Southwest Studies through working with a lot of our faculty. And people really like to, have that hands-on opportunity to see what the Southwest was really like. On a real personal note, I married really late in life because I was married to Fort Lewis College for a long time, and I loved my job. But I finally did get married, and Duane delivered the opening prayer at our wedding. However, he prefaced the prayer with this. He goes, you know, we never thought she would ever get married. And then he goes, evidently God did not think so either, as it's 30 below zero tonight and a blue moon. And it was. But I just loved him. And he was just one of the most wonderful assets to Fort Lewis College. And I think all of us in this room who knew him were better for it. And he took his role seriously as a professor. He took his role as a researcher and writer. He really helped put Fort Lewis on the map. And I even became a Cubs fan because of him. And I'm elated that I was one of his favorite students. But most importantly, he left his heart print all over Fort Lewis College and the community of Durango. And we're all better because we were part of knowing him. Thank you.
Duane wrote a column, newspaper column for the Durango Herald on sort of Durango history, town history. And he always got the dates right. It's pretty fascinating how many decisions were made in different sort of coffee shops and pharmacies in town that Duane attributed major decisions to in places like that. He's really was responsible for this building. So the Ballantyne family and Dr. Delaney conceived of the Center of Southwest Studies, and for years it was on top of Reed Library, and there's still a very interesting map up there and the original shelving for some books, which is, you know, a tiny space compared to what we have here. So when it came time to use some Colorado tax credits and have an enterprise zone and get some serious donations, including the Durango collection of weavings, which is just outstanding, Duane really championed this new building and naming this room the Lyceum. And the one thing that he did that the architects weren't ready for, the college hadn't really thought about, was the full basement. He said, we're going to need all that storage room. And at a considerable expense, but he was able to get that through the planning committee. And that's so critical to running a museum, archives, interpretive center. All the things that the center does is to be able to have that storage, and he was really an advocate for that. Sherry mentioned TLC for FLC. I remember those. They were a lot of fun. Duane and I got auctioned off for a TLC for FLC event on going up La Plata Canyon. And I wisely drove because I knew he was going to talk. So I drove. He kept talking about doing some of those back roads with his old Chevy Blazer. But we made it all the way up to the top, and we're looking at some of the mines. And what he really wanted to show the group, though, was, I think, La Plata County's most interesting outhouse. And this outhouse looks sort of right over, you know, kind of Lightner Creek, and it's stunning. I think it's a 3-holer, and it definitely has a breeze. So there's never a moment when you're not getting fresh air. And that was the highlight of the tour for Duane, sure, the mine was there and the mine was nice, but this outhouse was really special. He couldn't get anybody to sit in it, which is good because it had kind of a tilt. But I won't forget that part of the tour. President Dean Thomas, I think, had really a great line when she said that Duane, quote, writes books faster than I can read them. And yeah, his scholarship was extraordinary. Dr. Kessel's going to talk about Duane, and having seen him really in his last days at Sunshine Gardens, and I think he was unrecognizable because his hair got long, he had a beard, and the crew cut was gone. How did you even know it was Duane? Yeah, come on up.
Considered Duane Smith a true friend for 60 years, and the dozens of books he cordially inscribed to me testify. Over the years, I scribed books to him, but always the ratio was in Duane's favor, at least 4-1, all of which he proudly proclaimed, edited lovingly by his effervescent wife, Gay. When I left the National Park Service at Tumacacori National Monument in southern Arizona and enrolled in the PhD program at UNM in 1966, Professor Smith had already begun his long and distinguished career at Fort Lewis. I admit, coveted a position at Fort Lewis, but because the popular, solidly ensconced Bob Delaney was already teaching what I had to offer, there was no opening. From the 60s on, especially in the streets of the different cities where the Western History Association met, Little Rock, Portland, Sacramento, Reno, Duane became my ever-entertaining jogging partner. Somewhat later, our colleague David Weber of SMU made it a threesome. For me, those jogs were the best part of such meetings. Finally, during the 90s, with Duane serving as director of FLC's Center of Southwest Studies, he got me a couple of one-semester teaching gigs as a visiting professor. After that, I sold my place in Albuquerque, moved into a small house east of Durango, off County Road 223, which locals ingloriously known as the road to the dump. Duane was always working on something. After my retirement, he invariably greeted me, a fellow historian, "John, what are you working on now?" He seemed mildly offended when I responded, "Linking telemarks on skinny skis," although on several occasions we cross-country skied together as families. The Duane and Gay were frequent and enthusiastic guests at our house. As an active lay minister of the Methodist Church, Duane married our daughter Christy to Tom on the sunny deck of our home. Not right off, but eventually, Duane even forgave me for being a Dodgers fan. As guests in the Smiths' home at 2911 Cedar, for years we were greeted by a pudgy twin of the Rocky Mountain Chocolate Factory bear, a furry little dog named Buttercup, and an army of cats. I kept on my calendar Horace Tabor Day, when we often joined Duane and Gay for a celebratory Baskin-Robbins ice cream cake. After Gay suffered an aneurysm, Duane took on most of the household chores, including cleaning and cooking. Invited for supper, we usually enjoyed a James Ranch steak cooked on the grill just outside the back door. Duane would buy, and we'd have a pot. Duane would buy a can of cherries and two pie crusts, one for the top and one for the bottom. We never left hungry. After her aneurysm, Gay cheerfully spoke her mind. I'll never forget the Smiths' first visit to our remodeled home. Studying the glistening new ash wood floor and the stunning view of the La Platas out the front window, Gay chirped, "John, you don't deserve this." days before he died, I visited Duane at Sunshine Gardens. He recognized my voice before I got to his room. His often booming voice was notably weaker, but that iconic ear-to-ear smile never dimmed. That was my true friend, Duane Smith. Thank you.
Daniel said, quote, "I took my first college history class from Duane Smith in 1968, only 4 years after he had accepted a position at Fort Lewis College. Inspired by Duane's teaching style, I abandoned mathematics to major in history, thus began a long association with Duane in the history business. For decades, Duane's history classes were among the most popular at Fort Lewis College. He had a remarkable ability to make history come alive. For example, the final for his innovative Baseball and the American Dream class included a baseball game complete with 1880s rules." And I wonder what sort of uniforms they were wearing, but that sounds fun. And then a variety of awards, and Duane's also really important historic preservation work in Durango, especially after our vintage courthouse got knocked down in 1964, and then the real rush to put Main Street on as a National Register Historic District and later 3rd Avenue. Duane was a charter member of the City of Durango's Historic Preservation Board. He was also on the La Plata County Historical Commission when we started that, 15, 16 years ago. His efforts to preserve local historic landmarks included spearheading the drive to save Durango's only remaining smelter smokestack, which he saw as the perfect monument to the mining and smelting industries that once drove Durango's economy. While that effort ultimately failed, efforts to restore the old courthouse's historic clock and bell in the new wing of the courthouse, and then the restoration of the Animas City School succeeded. So again, we wanted Robert McDaniel to be here. He couldn't be, but he has a lot of great memories of Duane, including Duane teaching 4th graders about history in the Animas Museum, which I think would have been a lot of fun. Duane died at 87 after a long battle with Alzheimer's disease. He came here, finished his Bachelor's of Arts at CU Boulder in 1959, Master's in 1961, his Doctorate of Philosophy, PhD in 1964. So he comes to Fort Lewis when it moves up on the hill. So when it moves out of the old fort up here and then stays for, he taught over 40 years, I know. Lasted over 47 years at Fort Lewis. Wrote and co-authored over 50 books, textbooks, and professional articles. And as Dr. Kessel has said, his favorite was Horace Tabor. Did he talk about Baby Doe at all, or just Horace?
Oh, yeah, and we went to a performance of the Ballad of Baby Doe up, what is it, Central City, that's way above Denver, and there's an opera house up there.
Yes.
That was a memorable evening, and Baby Doe was a favorite topic.
Oh, good, good. Duane received the Fred H. Rosenstock Award from the Denver Westerners in 1987, Colorado Humanist of the Year from the Colorado Commission, Durango Historic Preservation Commission he was on, Society for American Baseball Research, Mining History Association, Western History Association, the Colorado Historical Society, served as La Plata County Democratic Chairman, and being a member of the Methodist Church. And of course, a Cubs fan, pretty exciting. So what I want to read now is some of the comments that came in after the Herald published Duane's obituary. And here's one that was unsigned, but condolences to Laura and Mike. We feel your loss and will miss him deeply. Whenever we went book shopping, finding a book written by Duane Smith always gave us a sense of pride in our small college town. We learned a lot from him. He will always be remembered as a pillar of our community. From Christine Beebe, as a student, I struggled with any history or writing class. Dr. Smith taught me that with stories, it would always be easier to remember history. I remember going to class, putting my head down on the desk and writing everything I could as he was talking. I would then go back to my room and rewrite every word again, and then read and reread the stories until the test. And then I'd write them again. For the first time in my life, I earned an A in history. I still have all of my notes from the 3 classes I took with Dr. Smith. I still remember most of the stories, and I still use the techniques I learned in his classes today in my own business. I use stories for illustrations. Dr. Smith probably never knew who I was because I was brutally shy, but I certainly knew him and will always be grateful for all that he taught me. Rest in peace, your legacy will live on. Terry Hutchison wrote, never enjoyed history classes until I was fortunate enough to be a student engaged in one of several of Dr. Duane Smith's lectures. He brought history to life through his research, retellings, animation, engagement. He simply drew you in with past to present events, stories, and the influence they had and have on our lives. Anyone and everyone who had the privilege of knowing him has been enriched by his presence. Martin McKinney wrote, Dr. Smith was one of my favorite professors at Fort Lewis and one of the leading experts on Colorado history in the state. Despite his academic acclaim, he was never pompous and was always available to help his students. He had a friendly manner in his lectures and a great sense of humor, which helped him make his students more attentive and eager to learn. He loved his subject matter, and his excitement for it was contagious to his students. With his credentials, both as a writer and an academician, he could have taught anywhere in the country, but loved living in Durango and teaching at Fort Lewis. Despite his academic success, he was never pompous. Another former student, truly one of the best educators at Fort Lewis College when I attended in the late 70s and early 80s. Dr. Smith was also very knowledgeable in the local area history, if I remember correctly. As a former student of his, my experience at Fort Lewis College was that much more memorable. Thank you for your kindness and lessons. Senior Smith, rest in peace, sir. Here's from an employee. As an employee of FLC, I took a class from Duane Smith. He always gave you something to take with you. He will be missed by all his past students, family, friends, and co-workers. Rest in peace, Duane, but keep your eye on the cubbies. Another student, I went to Fort Lewis from 2000 to 2004. I took his Colorado history class. Duane knew his Colorado history so well that he hardly ever wrote anything on the huge whiteboard in the class. He just spoke. So the accolades, go on and on. I'm just going to conclude with this one from Bob Reitiger. Durango has lost a true treasure. Professor Smith was a highlight of my college career. He inspired me to become a history teacher. His lectures were never dull, and he would leave you hanging on Friday, so you had to be there on Monday to find out the outcome. Our history is well preserved because of his writings and his wife's editing. He was always a pleasure to see and talk to, and there was never a dull moment in our conversations. Durango is going to miss this person that gave so much to us. Thank you, Dr. Smith, for a life well lived. I sure hope I spelled everything correctly. Yeah. All right, so happy to pass around the microphone.
Column, and it was exceptionally well written. There were lots of good insights about decision making, as you said, that were made at Parsons Drug, I think.
Parsons Drug, yeah.
Is where the leadership of Durango met in the morning. Democracy hadn't been heard of yet. But that was always a favorite read of mine and a favorite read of many people.
And I'm sure all those decisions were open and above board.
Yeah, they were, right?
Duane Smith was never pompous, but he was never quiet, and he was never humble either. was very important to him that I know who he was and what he did and what he cared about. And I respect him for that. The first book he ever gave me, and it wasn't at my, in the first month or whatever, but within the first maybe 3 months, he came to see me, and he brought this book for me. Rocky Mountain Boomtown, A History of Durango, Colorado. And he said no president of Fort Lewis College should be without the history of Durango. He figured I would get the Fort Lewis history from others, but I would have to get this if he gave it. He never dominated my time, but he popped up with sometime every few months. And when he did pop up, he would bring a book. And some of them were recently published, some of them had been published quite some time ago. But it was time for me to have that book. Someone's going to have to help me because the greatest glee he ever exhibited was the day he brought me his book on the ladies of the night. Now, somebody help me, is that on Iris Avenue? It's an avenue named after a flower. Andy, you must know that.
Iris Park.
Iris? Okay. Yes, by golly, I remember. So that one, I think, was the biggest grin. He always had a huge grin, but I think it was bigger that day than it had ever been.